On the south side, one gang, the Satan Disciples, rule supreme.
That Satan Disciples up in this.
I've seen people get shot in the head right in front of me, dying in my arms.
That's all I do. That's all I do.
These gangsters worship just one thing.
Money's mine, that's right.
Chicago's south side is the devil's playground.
When you envision the south side of Chicago, certain images might immediately spring to mind. We often hear about the persistent and distressing conflicts in this area, but there's another aspect of Southside Chicago, a less discussed side, equally plagued by issues. This is the authentic Southside Chicago, rarely highlighted in the media, a place where the so-called Satan Disciples act as the judge, jury, and executioner. This is how the Satan Disciples ran the Chicago underground for years, and how they still instill and exert pressure in one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Our story commences in the 1940s, a significant era in American history, just after the Great Depression. During this period, numerous Eastern European families migrated to Chicago, seeking employment in manufacturing. The majority of them settled along the South Branch of the Chicago River, spanning from Pilsen down to Little Village. By 1948, Pilsen had become a predominantly Polish and Slavic neighborhood. However, in the 1950s, Hispanic families began to move into the area, and as humans tend to be resistant to change, multiculturalism wasn't readily embraced. This influx of new residents didn't sit well with the local families, leading many Eastern Europeans to relocate to the suburbs, such as Cicero and Oak Park, to escape the changing demographics. Meanwhile, tensions simmered in the area. In response to the shifting landscape, Polish teenagers took matters into their own hands and formed an alliance in 1959. Around a dozen of them came together to establish the Satan Disciples, also known as SDs, choosing a name intended to deter potential adversaries. They believed they needed protection from the increasing number of new immigrants in the neighborhood. However, once formed, the SDs quickly realized that the Mexican teenagers had no intentions of being their rivals. In fact, they found the Mexican teens to be quite cool, and some of them even wanted to join forces with the SDs. In their inaugural year, the SDs evolved to comprise 50% Mexican members, fostering unity in the neighborhood. During this time, the SDs outlined their mission and a set of rules for all members. The very first law of the Satan Nation was that all members must acknowledge the leadership and command of the higher-ranked members. The rule said, all members shall acknowledge the leadership and new concept handed down to them. Insubordination will not be tolerated within the family. Their second rule was that against snitching, no telling was allowed under any circumstances. Caught in an act of treason or breaking the code of silence against the nation will not be allowed. Some of the other laws and rules that we find under the SDs were rather unique. Satan Disciples members were encouraged to find employment, establish businesses, and contribute positively to society, whether by opening a restaurant, working in a plant, or becoming a firefighter. Just as long as you didn't become a police officer, these were all considered honorable positions for SD members. Essentially, the SDs existed as a brotherhood of Pilsen residents, protecting one another from the challenging streets of Chicago. However, this sense of unity came at a price. Members were required to contribute a portion of their earnings to the highest-ranking member, known as the King or King Satan. The King was elected through a committee and was expected to maintain order and reason among members. Thanks to this structured system, the early years of the SDS were marked by relative smoothness and peace. Yet in 1964, new rivals emerged, shaking the balance they had established. On the other side of the train tracks from Pilsen lay the territory of the notorious Latin Kings. Unlike the SDs, the Kings were constantly on the offensive, seeking to expand their influence into new territories. Their approach involved arriving in a neighborhood, attempting to recruit young members. If recruitment efforts failed, they didn't hesitate to resort to violence. In 1964, the Latin Kings set their sights on Pilsen, sending members into SD territory in the hopes of recruiting them. This marked the SD's initial test, and they responded by adopting a defensive stance against the Latin Kings. The SD rulebook did not permit them to initiate offensive actions, putting them at a significant disadvantage. This dynamic persisted for a couple of years until one SD member, Agapito Villalobos, later called King Aggie, decided he'd had enough. Unlike the predominantly passive and low-key SD members, Aggie was exceptionally aggressive and occasionally violent. He recognized that at the current pace, the SD was at risk of being completely taken over, and something needed to change. So he made the bold move of going on the offensive by himself, even establishing his own SD block on 24th and Washtenaw, right in front of his mother's house. This audacious decision contradicted the original SD rulebook. But gradually, Aggie managed to recruit new SD members in his area who were willing to join the offensive effort. Essentially, he adopted the Latin King's strategy and applied it in their own territory. Aggie ushered in a new era for the Satan Disciples, a move that eventually paid off, leading to his election as the Satan Disciples leader in 1980, known as King Aggie. Right from the beginning of his leadership, King Aggie initiated significant changes, pushing the SDs to expand into new territories by any means necessary. Through various demonstrations, they secured a substantial amount of territory in the Southwest, and even in the suburbs of Cicero, Illinois. Instead of pursuing regular employment, King Aggie encouraged SD members to take to the streets and engage in illegal activities. This shift marked a turning point in Pilsen, as the SDs gradually extended their influence throughout the city. But then came October of 1983, and everything ground to a halt. King Aggie faced a second robbery charge, earning him a 12-year sentence in an Illinois state prison. Unlike the Mexican mafia, the SDs did not endorse leadership from behind bars. Consequently, with King Aggie incarcerated, the Satan Disciples needed a new leader. During this period, many of the original members expressed dissatisfaction with the gang's direction. Violence was claiming lives left and right, and the rulebook was falling by the wayside. In a bid to shift their trajectory, the Satan Disciples elected a new leader with a radically different approach. This leader was a young member named Danny Valencia, also known as Gizmo. A native of Pilsen, Gizmo despised the transformation of his neighborhood. He sought to restore the SDS to its original form and reduce street violence. Under Gizmo's leadership, members promptly pursued gainful employment and ceased attacking rivals without cause. Over 12 years, Gizmo guided the SDs toward becoming a legitimate business. However, the situation took a turn in September 1995 when King Aggie returned to the streets of Chicago. Expecting to be revered as in the old days, he was met with a different response. Time had passed, and the new generation remained fiercely loyal to Gizmo. Nonetheless, according to the rulebook, King Aggie was meant to reclaim his leadership position. King Aggie returned as the leader, with Gizmo as his second in command. In the initial months of his return, King Aggie realized he couldn't assert authority over everyone, and he observed that the younger members continued to heed Gizmo's leadership. This frustrated him, prompting King Aggie to call a meeting of the Satan Disciples on November 1st, 1995. Around 15 members convened at King Aggie's house, seated around his dining room table to discuss the disconnect in the gang. During the meeting, a member expressed frustration that their earnings were being used for activities they disapproved of, specifically funding attacks on the Latin Kings instead of supporting SD members. King Aggie initially brushed off the comment until the member persisted, warning that they would vote him out and reinstate King Gizmo if he didn't change his ways. The room fell silent, and King Aggie promptly ended the meeting. Subsequently, King Aggie summoned Gizmo to his house at 9:41 p.m., asking for a conversation to clear things up. Gizmo, not suspecting anything, complied, arriving at King Aggie's house by 10 p.m. However, as he walked in through the side entrance, he noticed two men in front of him. Before he could react, tragedy struck, devastating the Pilsen community. Many SD members were loyal to Gizmo because of the positive changes he'd initiated. Initially, confusion reigned. How could this have happened to Gizmo? Did King Aggie play a part, or was it someone else? The next morning, King Aggie coincidentally took a flight to Dallas, Texas, seeking refuge with extended family. Given that the incident occurred on his property, King Aggie became the prime suspect. However, the Chicago police could not locate him. Nonetheless, they did manage to find suspect number 2, King Aggie's right-hand man known as Vicious Trejo. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimonies, Vicious Trejo received a 30-year sentence. Then in May 1996, the FBI located King Aggie in Dallas. His case stirred considerable attention in Chicago, as he had become an infamous figure. It was widely believed that his conviction was imminent. Yet, during the trial, King Aggie's neighbor recanted her statements about witnessing his actions. The reasons for this reversal remained speculative, but as a result, King Aggie walked away as a free man. Following his release, King Aggie sought to return and resume his position as the leader, seemingly oblivious to the fact that most wanted him gone. As far as our knowledge goes, King Aggie was never spotted in Chicago again. Following Gizmo's passing, the SD experienced a profound decline in structure. Members began acting independently, disregarding any semblance of rules, and even becoming each other's primary rivals. This brings us to 1999. By this time, the Satan Disciples had expanded their presence throughout the city, with one of their territories being on the west side, particularly in Garfield Park. A reputed member named Teodoro Baez resided in an upstairs apartment there, known by his alias, Mandingo. Mandingo was a formidable member who didn't hesitate to confront anyone. He operated alongside his right-hand man, Juan Estrada, and together, they generated income and exerted influence on those who crossed their path. In early August, Juan became increasingly frustrated with Mandingo over unpaid debts, amounting to $1,000. Finally, on August 5, 1999, Juan decided to confront Mandingo. It was a scorching summer morning when Juan called Mandingo, arranging a meeting at his apartment. Juan readied himself and asked his girlfriend Janet to drive him there. They arrived at 11 a.m., and Juan got out of the car, heading to the apartment. The two friends sat down and began discussing the situation. Mandingo attempted repeatedly to steer the conversation away from the topic, but Juan was not willing to divert. His frustration grew, and he began calling Mandingo derogatory names. Initially, he called him a derogatory term and then escalated by using more offensive language. At this point, Juan stood up and used an aggressive tone, provoking Mandingo. Despite being friends and fellow SD members, Mandingo snapped. He stood up, brandished a firearm, and fired a shot into Juan's leg, causing him to scream. Following this, Mandingo regrettably retrieved his samurai sword. After grabbing the sword, he remembered that Juan had arrived with his girlfriend, so he calmly asked her to come upstairs. Naturally, she followed his instructions, unaware of what awaited her. Tragically, this was when her fate was sealed. Juan and Janet were discovered in the Chicago River 3 days later. After reviewing phone records, authorities determined that Teodoro Baez was the last person Juan had called. Consequently, they brought him in for questioning on August 27, 1999. During the interrogation, Mandingo realized that the police lacked substantial evidence. Nevertheless, he chose to confess to everything he had done. Mandingo was promptly charged, and his arrest became a national news sensation. The SD community was in disbelief over his actions, and his fellow members were furious. Mandingo understood the potential consequences that awaited him from his own group. Consequently, after just 2 weeks in jail, Mandingo wrote letters to the judge, pleading to be placed in protective custody. Initially, his requests were denied, but after 3 consecutive letters, they finally granted him protective custody for the remainder of his incarceration. The case became a significant event in Chicago, with the district attorney pushing for the harshest possible consequences. In the end, Teodoro Baez received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Many SD members still connect incidents like this to King Aggie, holding him responsible for disrupting the gang's structure and making it acceptable for members to turn against their own brothers. Following these events, things took a turn for the worse for the Satan disciples. The new era was unrecognizable, and it would likely have King Gizmo deeply concerned. It was during this time that a new member stepped into a leadership role, a young man named Tommy Para, known as Tommy Guns. In stark contrast to previous leaders, Tommy was highly motivated by financial gain and would go to great lengths to achieve it. Upon taking the leadership position, he embarked on actions that directly violated the SD rulebook, engaging in business with the gangster disciples, particularly in the Rockwell Gardens area. SD members were expected to keep financial transactions within their ranks and expand from within. However, Tommy was determined to prove that teamwork could indeed make the dream work, even if it meant defying the rulebook. In 2001, Tommy and his trusted associates started generating significant income through their collaboration with the GDs in Rockwell Gardens, accumulating more money in 1 year than any other Satan Disciples member in history. However, Tommy's thriving financial ventures also set the stage for his own downfall. In 2002, Chicago police initiated an investigation into the GDs in Rockwell Gardens. While monitoring the housing projects, law enforcement noticed a conspicuous figure who did not fit in with the rest of the residents. Their focus shifted away from the GDs and onto Tommy. The police started tracking his every move, employing SD informants to gather information. Within just 1 month of the investigation, Tommy and 2 of his associates were apprehended. Upon his arrest, police made a startling discovery. Tommy's father was actually a Chicago police captain. This revelation was against SD rules, but it also piqued the interest of Chicago police. Nevertheless, they did not investigate his father further, and Tommy was sentenced to 25 years. A 25-year sentence, despite not having caused harm to anyone. This marked the second consecutive leader who had broken major rules, leading to an erosion of the gang's internal discipline and decision-making. On September 6, 2010, a Sunday evening on 24th and Washington, the Seoul SD block in Little Village, an incident unfolded. A member named Luis Padin was present on the block when a car, occupied by two women, double-parked on 24th. Luis grew suspicious, thinking they might be Latin kings, and approached the car. He inquired whether they were Latin kings, to which they responded, "No, we're girls," while giggling. Regrettably, Luis interpreted this as disrespect. Luis started shooting upon hearing those words, and one of the girls, Jennifer Alvarado, lost her life. This incident sparked significant outrage in the community. However, Luis Padin would not be arrested for another 3 years. In the meantime, even his fellow SD members were disappointed in his actions, notably a member named Robert Vela. Robert, known as Bobby D, was one of the original members on 24th and had moved to the South Chicago suburb of Midlothian, where he was raising his family. Upon hearing about the incident, Bobby returned to his original block to rectify the situation. This brings us to October 30th, 2010. Bobby arrived at 7 p.m. and stationed himself on the block with some younger members. While he was conversing with these members, a man crept up from behind the buildings and walked behind Bobby. Before you know it, shots were fired and Bobby D lost his life. This was a significant event in the SD community, and many members were angered. Chicago police realized that this could trigger a major retaliation and considered it to be a revenge attack from the Latin Kings for the September 6th incident. However, after speaking with Latin Kings members, they determined this wasn't the case. Instead, they turned their attention to the SDs, suspecting it might have been an inside job. Informants indicated that a fellow SD member from 24th was involved in this attack. Due to the sealed nature of the case, the exact identity of the assailant remains unknown, but it could be deduced. Fast forward to 2012, and Luis Padin was still actively involved in street activities. On February 18, 2012, Padin was driving around the Latin Kings territory looking for any rivals. At 4 p.m., while driving down California Avenue, he spotted a car carrying Latin Kings members traveling in the opposite direction. He swiftly executed a U-turn, sped down California to catch up, and eventually pulled directly in front of the car, trapping them. Luis rolled down his window, and due to surveillance footage, he was swiftly arrested. After recovering his weapon, police were able to link it to the September 6th incident. Following a lengthy trial, Luis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These incidents contributed to the intensification of the rivalry between the SDs and the Latin Kings. However, they had other rivals besides the Kings. One such rival was the local gang known as 2-6, operating in Little Village. Since the 1980s, the SDs and 2-6 had been bitter rivals, battling for control over Little Village territory. In the summer of 2015, as part of their inclination to encourage legal employment for their members, the SDS had some of its members working in security for a towing company. Their role was to ensure the safety of the repo man. Two of these members were Carlos Cregan from Whiting, Indiana, and Jonathan Rodriguez from Calumet, Illinois. As security personnel for a towing company, they were essentially on standby until they were dispatched to a scene. However, one incident that occurred on August 22, 2015 changed their lives forever. On that day, the two SD members found themselves waiting in the clearing neighborhood of the south side of Chicago. As boredom set in while sitting in their car, they decided to drive to a bar on West 63rd. At the bar, they struck up a conversation with a random guy named Leonardo Morales, and the discussion lasted until the bar closed at 2 a.m. Afterward, they received a call for assistance from a driver who was having trouble with a repossession. So they hopped in their truck and asked Leonardo if he wanted to come along for fun. He agreed, and the trio headed to the scene. To summarize the situation, they managed to defuse the argument, and it seemed like just another regular workday. Afterward, Leonardo asked if they could give him a ride home, and they agreed. As they all got into Jonathan's car, Leonardo began talking about his past. He revealed that he used to be a member of 2-6 before changing his life. In the front seat, the two SD members exchanged glances without saying a word, nodding to each other. When they reached a nearby alley, they asked Leonardo to join them for a smoke break, and he agreed. As the three left the car, one of the SD members took out his burner, and Leonardo Morales was another victim of gang violence. The two SD members then sped away in their truck, leaving Leonardo in the alley. Little did they know that witnesses from the neighboring area observed this and promptly reported it. As a result, both SD members were raided and booked into Cook County Jail. Incidents like this have contributed to the Satan Disciples' tarnished reputation over the past decade. Moreover, the Satan Disciples have rivalries not only with the Latin Kings and 2-6 6, but also with another significant section of Chicago, namely the Almighty Saints, who hold the title of the most active gang in the back of the yards neighborhood. Over the years, the SDS and the Almighty Saints have been fierce rivals, making the Almighty Saints their fourth largest rival. However, starting in 2016, the Almighty Saints escalated to become the primary rival. The rivalry between the two gangs took a particularly dark turn on December 26, 2016, and this event set the stage for intensified hostilities. On that cold winter day, Jamil al-Shawbi was walking his dogs in the back of the yards neighborhood, where his family lived. This area, known as Davis Park, was part of Almighty Saints territory, referred to as Halo City. A member of the Satan disciples, Hector Aguirre, was driving around Halo City looking for rivals, but couldn't find anyone outside due to the freezing weather. However, when he arrived at Davis Park and saw Jamil walking his dogs, he mistakenly believed him to be a member of the Almighty Saints. He jumped out of his car and ran into the park to confront him. Jamil lost his life on that unfortunate day. Later, it turned out that Jamil had no affiliation with the Almighty Saints. The Saints, deeply offended that their rivals would make this mistake, decided to retaliate. The ensuing year witnessed a back-and-forth escalation of hostilities between the Almighty Saints and the Satan disciples, with high-ranking members from both sides losing their lives in the conflict. The violence was particularly intense during 2017, surpassing the already significant tensions between other Southside Chicago neighborhoods. The Almighty Saints, as a result, became the most prominent rival for the SDs. The rivalry extended beyond the streets, as demonstrated on February 1, 2020. On this day, a reputed SD member, Christian Gonzalez, found himself booked into Cook County Jail. After processing, Christian was placed in a cell with a random cellmate. When he walked into the cell and saw the man sitting on the bunk, both froze. His cellmate was a reputed member of the Almighty Saints named Pedro Ruiz. This situation was highly irregular, as rival members were never supposed to share the same cell. Nevertheless, once they were locked in, there was no turning back. While the Satan disciples may not often make headlines in the media, they certainly have a presence in Chicago's streets. These conflicts have real-life consequences, resulting in the loss of lives and destruction in communities. Let's take this moment to reflect on the impact of gang violence, not just in Chicago, but in communities worldwide. It's a destructive cycle that often affects the most vulnerable and leaves scars that last generations. We should all work together to break this cycle and create safer, more promising environments for our youth. Positive change is possible, and it starts with understanding, compassion, and a commitment to providing opportunities and support for those at risk of falling into this dangerous lifestyle. We all have a role to play in making our communities safer and more prosperous.